Okay class, another video about finding zeros of polynomials. In this video we're going to be looking at polynomials that have a GCF, or greatest common factor. So real quick, what is a zero of a polynomial? As always, it is an x value when y is equal to 0. So let's look at a polynomial with a GCF. Here's the first one we're going to look at. Y is equal to 2x squared minus 8x. Okay, so as with any other polynomial that we've tried to find the zeros of so far, we're going to do two things first. We're going to make y equal to 0. And in order to figure out what our x values can be now, we're going to factor this equation so that we can solve each factor independently. So, how do I factor this equation? Well, the first thing you always look for when you factor any polynomial is, do I have a GCF? Well, are there any numbers that divide evenly into both 2 and 8? Yes, there are. Both 2 and 8 divide evenly by the number 2. So 2 is part of my greatest common factor. What about variables? Are there any, can I take an x out of both sides? I believe I can, because this term has an x squared in it, and this term has an x. Could I take an x squared out of both sides? No, I can't, because this term has an x squared. Sure, that's great. I could take an x squared out of that side, but this term doesn't have an x squared. It has just an x. So x squared would be too big to be part of our common factor. So all I can take out is just an x, which means that 2x is my GCF of this polynomial. Well, what's my other factor now? The other factor is what you get when you divide your original polynomial by the greatest common factor. So if I divide 2x squared by 2x, what do I get? I get just x. And when I divide negative 8x by 2x, what do I get there? Well, I just get negative 4. Can I check my answer? What if I distributed 2x, if I multiplied 2x back into this other factor, x minus 4? Wouldn't I get 2x times x, that's 2x squared, and 2x times negative 4 is negative 8x. So if I multiplied the 2x back into this factor, x minus 4, I would get the polynomial that I started with, which confirms that I factored correctly. Okay, so now that I've factored, I have two things multiplied together equaling 0, which means either one or the other has to equal 0, and the equation is still true. So that means I can set both my factors equal to 0, and then I can just solve for x on both sides. So let's look at the first factor, my greatest common factor. If I divide both sides by 2, I've got 0 divided by 2 is equal to x. But 0 divided by 2 is just the number 0. So in this equation, x can only equal 0. Let's look at this equation. 0 equals x minus 4. If I add 4 to both sides, I get that x can only equal 4 for this equation to be true. So I have two different x values that make y equal to 0. 0 and 4. That means that the zeros of this polynomial are 0 and 4. Two x values that would make y equal to 0. Great. Let's look at another example. Let's do y is equal to 3x plus 27. So if I want to find the zeros of this polynomial, I'm going to set y equal to 0, and then I'm going to factor. Is there a greatest common factor? Can anything divide evenly into 3 and 27? Yes, 3 can. And if I divide 3 out of 3x plus 27, I'm going to get x plus 9 as the other factor. Alright, so now that I've factored, can I set both factors equal to 0? Okay, well here is an interesting thing about this equation. Because the greatest common factor doesn't have a variable in it, there's no way to set this factor equal to 0. Because 3 will never equal 0. So what does that mean? Well, when you have a factor that doesn't have a variable in it, there are no zeros that come from that factor. So I can't do anything with this factor. But I can set the other factor equal to 0. So x plus 9 equals 0. Subtract 9 from both sides, and I get x is equal to negative 9. So in this equation, I only have one 0. I only have one 0. And that 0 is negative 9. The greatest common factor did not give me a 0 because there were no variables in it. So I only had one 0. Alright, let me do another equation here. One last equation. And that is y is equal to 7x squared plus x. So again, I'm going to set y equal to 0. And then I'm going to find any factor. I'm going to factor if I can. So are there any greatest common factors? Anything that divides evenly into both terms? Well, I think just 1x can come out of both terms. So if I divide 7x squared by x, I'm going to get just 7x. And if I divide x by x, I'm going to get 1. Now I'll set both equations equal to 0. And I already solved this one because this just says x is equal to 0. I'm going to set my other factor equal to 0. I can subtract 1 from both sides, and I can divide by 7. And what I found is that the zeros of this equation, the zeros of this polynomial, are 0, the number 0, and the number negative 1/7. Those are my x values that make y equal to 0.